started. It's my favorite 2 weeks of the semester, getting to talk to everybody about a research area that I'm really interested in, which is obviously psychopathy. So we'll be talking today specifically about how we define psychopathy, what it is not, how we measure the tools that we have to measure psychopathy, and how it relates to offending. Part one of the lecture is about establishing what psychopathy is and what it is not, and then looking at things like, does it change, can it be treated, how does it relate to offending. Next week we'll go into a little bit more of like my personal experiences of sitting down and assessing youth with extremely high features of psychopathy. What it's like, what do they say to me, how do I respond when they say really awful things, what are some of the things that stand out, what are some techniques that I've learned in my experience that help ask kids questions, how I sort of respond to the different things that they say, how I develop rapport with them, how I deal with somebody who's showing signs of features of psychopathy right in the actual interview itself. So before we move on to any of that, just to highlight on page 133 of your textbook, this is a really good example of how to do a write-up of an empirical paper. It's probably a little bit too long for what you would do for your term paper, but I think it's a good example of some of the details that you'll want to include. If you also have a look at page 138 of your textbook, it'll show you how the authors of the textbook recognize that one study has more methodological strengths than another one, and therefore that other study is more important. These are the types of things that I want you to think about. Which study matters more when you get conflicting pieces of information? If one says psychopathy is related to offending and another one says it's not, why do you think that is? Is it because one study is stronger than the other? Do they look at different types of offending? These are the questions that you have to ask yourself when you're reading these empirical articles. We'll begin by looking at psychopathy as a construct, its definitions, some contentious issues, how it is caused or how people believe psychopathy is caused, and its importance to us as criminologists and criminology students. So like last week's lecture where I sort of helped us understand schizophrenia by distinguishing it from schizotypal disorder, I think it's also really important to talk about all of the things that psychopathy is not. Googling or going onto YouTube and searching for videos on psychopathy can provide students with such a misleading understanding of what psychopathy actually is. So many different terms are used interchangeably or misunderstood, so I really want to spend some time to talk about here are things that psychopathy is not. We'll be able to, in this class, distinguish between psychopathy and sociopathic personality disorder, psychopathy and psychosis, and psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. So we'll talk a little bit about these in detail, but just to mention, one of the things that I think is clear is that sociopathic personality disorder is something that's more so talked about in media circles, in the news, in movies, television shows, and so on. It's not something that is actually routinely assessed in forensic psychology or in criminology. It's more of a jargon term that people will use. We'll go into a little bit about the history of psychopathy, sociopathy, and antisocial personality disorder. When I was first hired to go into the youth custody center to interview kids with features of psychopathy, I called my mom and I was so excited that I got this job and told her that I was going to be assessing for psychopathy amongst kids. And my mom was like the toughest woman that I've ever met. I've seen her cry, I think, twice in my lifetime. Once was when my brother and I were being brats, and then the second time was on this phone call when she didn't really understand what psychopathy was, and she thought that I told her, like, I'm gonna go into this interview room where no staff can hear me, it's just one-on-one with me and the kid, and they've committed these really serious and violent offenses like homicide, sexual offenses, sexual homicide, and I'm going to learn about their personality. She thought that psychopathy was psychosis, that these individuals, and this was sort of like a similar time to the Vincent Lee case that we talked about last week, an individual going through a state of psychosis, having delusions, hallucinations, and that they could at any point in time just attack me for no reason whatsoever. So what's really important to understand about psychopathy is we can go back to its original definition or original term. So we didn't start off with the term psychopathy and then move forward. We actually began with the term in French, mal sans délire, which essentially means sickness but without delusion. So psychopathy and psychosis are almost the very opposite. With psychosis, there are clear delusions. With psychopathy, the behavior that they engage in is very purposeful. It's not because of a delusion or a distortion of reality. They know exactly what they are doing. That's why you wouldn't tend to find an individual with psychopathy as NCRMD, because they are aware that what they're doing is wrong. They just don't care. They just don't have that sensitivity to punishment. They don't care about what could happen to other people. So that's one of the key differences between psychopathy and psychosis. I think these differences are very clear and very dramatic. But when we begin to distinguish psychopathy from sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder, the nuances get a little bit more detailed to understand how they differ. So again, it can be kind of frustrating for students because you get told so many different terms that sometimes are meant to use the same or similar things. So one of the terms that you'll also see, especially in your textbook or in other literature, is the term disocial personality disorder. And it's, again, frustrating. Like, psychologists could just get things right the first time, find a way to agree on what they mean by specific terms, and won't confuse the heck out of students. But basically, here's how to think about it. We have antisocial personality disorder, which is included in the DSM. And then we also have disocial personality, which is basically the ICD, that's Europe's version of antisocial personality disorder. So the ICD is the International Classification of Disease, and it uses the term disocial personality disorder to refer to the North American term of antisocial personality disorder. So disocial personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder are basically the same thing. Another term that you'll get exposed to is subcriminal psychopathy, or what some people will refer to as successful psychopathy. One of the books that was written by Robert Hare is called Snakes and Suits. It's maybe one of the most influential or widely read pop culture books on psychopathy. The other one would be Robert Hare's Without Conscience. I would say that Snakes and Suits is a little bit more for mainstream audiences or a more general audience. And I really do not like the term successful psychopathy. Even if an individual with psychopathy might have success, that success is typically very short term. A successful psychopath might be described as somebody who is a successful business person or a politician or a judge, lawyer, someone like that. But often what we'll see is that their success in these positions is very short-lived, or they didn't earn these positions to begin with. When we think about what makes being a human being great, we can think about the opportunity to form social relationships with other people, to have friendships, to have people that we care about, to have others that really care about us, to have these meaningful relationships where we can trust that other person, we can confide in that other person. For somebody with strong features of psychopathy, maybe they might have short-term financial success, but their relationships will be forever superficial. They won't see that person as actually meaningful to them or their relationship, their well-being. I don't really think that that's a very positive way to live. They'll have their life characterized by desire for short-term goals, short-term relationships, immediate success. They'll be sensation-seeking. Even if they're not necessarily involved in offending, or at least maybe they're just not getting caught for offending, but they will likely be involved in other high-risk behaviors that are going to put their long-term health at risk. So I don't tend to like the use of the term successful psychopathy, because I think it can also sort of dehumanize individuals. Individuals with psychopathy did not do anything to ask for psychopathy. It's not like they had a series of rational choices that led to them having a lack of empathy for others, manipulating others, having a lack of remorse for other people. It's not to say that we can excuse their behavior. Their behavior very likely needs to be punished. They need to be incarcerated, not because I think that incarceration will help deter them from offending in the future, but because incarceration will actually just limit that person's opportunity to bring further harm to other people in the community. How are students supposed to make sense of all the different things that we've just discussed? there's so many different definitions and perspectives. What is it that you should actually take away from this class? My opinion comes from being in a class and being mentored by Steve Hart, who is somebody who is well known for his research on the assessment of psychopathy. And he actually teaches a class for undergrad and grad students at the same time on psychopathy. It's a phenomenal class. I've sat in on it. I think it would really benefit students. I think for undergraduate students, it's also really interesting because you get to just sit in on a class with grad students. So it's a class for undergrad and grad students simultaneously. You'll be graded differently than grad students, so don't worry, you don't have to compete with them. But it'll give you a really good sense of what grad school is like. What Steve Hart explained to me was that when the people responsible for creating the DSM originally came up with the antisocial personality disorder criteria, they developed these criteria specifically to measure psychopathy. So according to the developers of the DSM, antisocial personality disorder is psychopathy. They are capturing the exact same disorder. What Steve has explained to me is that the key issue is that how we measure psychopathy is very different from how the developers of the DSM specified that we should measure psychopathy through antisocial personality disorder. The criteria for antisocial personality disorder are much more simple than the criteria for psychopathy. Criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and I'll put them up on the screen here, are really like behavioral anchors. Things that can be measured as either present or absent. Because keep in mind why the developers of the DSM created the DSM to begin with. They wanted to be able to measure the prevalence of different disorders. And if the measurement of these disorders is too complex, we're going to get a lot of variability across jurisdictions, cultures, time, and so on when it comes to the prevalence of these different disorders. So by making really simple criteria for antisocial personality disorder, it helped ensure that antisocial personality disorder would be measured the same way, whether we're talking about Canada, Belarus, Brazil, China, India, and so on. Herbie Cleckley was one of the real fathers of the modern day definition of psychopathy. His definition of psychopathy did not really align with all the criteria laid out. Diagnosing psychopathy looked different from the way that they were diagnosing antisocial personality disorder, even though they were supposed to be the same thing. Here's how I think we make sense of it. The DSM intended antisocial personality disorder to be the same as psychopathy, but psychopathy, how we measure it, and antisocial personality disorder and how we measure it are very, very different. Virtually all individuals with strong features of psychopathy would meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. However, most individuals that meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder do not meet the criteria for scoring high on a measure of psychopathy. Another thing that we can think about is that individuals who meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder but do not meet the criteria for psychopathy could be what some people consider as sociopaths.
The name's Sherlock Holmes and the address is 221B Baker Street.
Dear God, what is it like in your funny little brains? It must be so boring.
He's a psychopath.
Our favourite psychopath.
I'm not a psychopath, Anderson. I'm a high-functioning sociopath. Do your research.
Individual with antisocial personality disorder, but not with psychopathy, in terms of how it's measured clinically, would be somebody that would meet the criteria for sociopathy. My research never mentions sociopaths or sociopathy. I don't consider it to be a real thing because it's not actually assessed by clinicians. And so I would tend to err on the side of antisocial personality disorder without psychopathy is maybe what people think of when we talk about sociopathy. If you are working in a prison setting, so let's say that you are a forensic psychologist working in a federal custody center in Canada, there can be some problems with the value of antisocial personality disorder as a diagnosis in this setting. Specifically, far too many individuals meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. You can have upwards of 80% of all individuals in that particular custody center meeting the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. The diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder covers 2 to 3 times as many prisoners as the diagnosis of psychopathy. So basically, antisocial personality disorder is too common to really be helpful for us in distinguishing the most serious and violent persons. The developers of the DSM even sort of acknowledge, like, maybe we screwed up by saying that psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder are the same thing, because now in the DSM-5, under their description of antisocial personality disorder, they also have psychopathy as a specific, they call it a specifier of antisocial personality disorder, to basically distinguish those with ASPD only versus those with ASPD and features of psychopathy would include things like a lack of anxiety or fear and some other really key personality traits. These personality traits include a bold interpersonal style, so they might be maybe daring, they might engage in maladaptive behaviors like being fraudulent, so not just like reckless behaviors, but real purposeful fraudulent acts. We'll talk about individuals who have high levels of attention seeking, that low level of anxiety, which is sort of like stress immunity. Right, so it's been like, I've probably been talking for 15 minutes and you're maybe wondering, is he ever actually going to tell us what psychopathy actually is? And so this is the slide for that. And first thing I'll say is that there are differences of opinion, and in fact, really contentious differences with respect to what psychopathy is and is not. So contentious that Robert Hare, the developer of the psychopathy checklist, has actually sued other researchers over the definition of psychopathy as a way to try and promote his instrument, and I'll get into that in more detail when we talk about different measures of psychopathy. Psychopathy includes 3 key features: impairments in affective functioning, interpersonal functioning, and behavioral functioning. Impairments in affective functioning really are talking about how an individual internalizes things. So affect is referring to things like a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy for other people. This is an individual that is uncaring, tends to be unemotional, is uncommitted to other people. They are going to process the world in a way where they don't really care about the feelings of others, and they don't really have a lot of depth of emotion. This does not mean that individuals with psychopathy do not get angry or do not experience happiness, but their anger tends to be very fleeting. It can come on and off at like a moment's notice, or they can be very, very happy and then something minor could happen and then they feel very, very angry, where it's something that probably shouldn't sway their emotions to that degree. Deficits in interpersonal functioning are referring to how individuals interact with other people. So it's sort of more external functioning. So this would include things like manipulation, dominance over other people, lying and deceitfulness. It will refer to somebody who's very grandiose, has a very high sense of self, wants to be the one talking all the time, believes they're unique and worthy of special attention or privileges, and views other people essentially as beneath them. The behavioral domain is referring to impulsive and irresponsible personality traits. So individuals that are risk-taking, sensation-seeking, they will lack goals, or especially for individuals who are more grandiose, they will lack reasonable or rational long-term goals. So an individual might believe that they're going to become a doctor, that's their goal, but they only have a grade 10 education and they dropped out of high school. So there's a mismatch between what their goal is and the steps that they've actually taken to meet that goal. They tend to just think that these things will happen for them. So they have a preference for immediate gratification. The more controversial trait is whether offending is a symptom or a consequence of psychopathy. So Robert Hare and others believe that it is a symptom of psychopathy, so we should measure a person's criminal involvement as part of the measurement of psychopathy. What Steve Hart, David Cook, and others argue, and I tend to agree with this side, is that offending should only be considered a consequence of psychopathy. I agree with this perspective for two reasons. First relates to tautological issues. So another word for tautology, or another phrase, is circular logic or circular reasoning. We're trying to use psychopathy to predict offending. So we shouldn't use offending to measure psychopathy. So that's what creates that tautology. Key reason why we're assessing psychopathy is our ability to understand whether somebody is at a heightened risk to engage in crime in the future. So we should exclude offending from our measure of psychopathy. Other reason for why we should exclude offending from our measure of psychopathy is because psychopathy is supposed to be a personality disorder. We're supposed to be assessing personality traits like being manipulative, lacking empathy, lacking remorse, and so on. Offending is a concrete behavior. Relying on the measure of offending is really reducing psychopathy back to like antisocial personality disorder features, where we have very clear characteristics that we can measure because they're behaviors that are very easy to see. Psychopathy is supposed to be a personality disorder, so we should focus on personality traits. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit different here. Now that we have a good understanding of sort of what the features of psychopathy are, we're going to go over an interview that was conducted with Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, who was involved in a series of sexual assaults and homicides. I'm going to break down some of the features of psychopathy that I see in the interview, and if you have any questions about what I see, or if you see something that you think I missed and want to know more about it, just leave some notes for me in your tutorial group discussion.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
Convicted serial killer Richard Ramirez seemed to relish the concept of evil, and once upon a time, a lot of folks in the state of California viewed the one-time Texas altar boy as evil's human embodiment.
Yes, I am evil. Not 100%, but I am evil.
In the summer of 1985, the Texas drifter descended like a deadly disease on a hot California night. A one-man epidemic of madness and murder.
And just as a reminder, I talked to you about how it was important in your papers not to editorialize. That little statement about
one-man epidemic of madness and murder
basically is the type of thing that you don't want to include in your paper, that type of using like cliches, colloquialism, and kind of editorializing.
One of America's first serial killers to be given a brand name, the Night Stalker.
Lock your doors, lock your windows. If you have the ability to provide additional security devices, then by all means do so.
Who wants to be next? I don't. No one else does.
He preyed on both women and men, young and old. He slipped through windows, slit throats, raped, tortured, and killed.
What he did to me.
So that's another thing to keep your eye out for when assessing for features of psychopathy. Individuals that engage in a lot of different types of crime, so they might offend against both children and adults, against women and men. They commit violent crimes, but they also engage in like break and enters and burglary. The versatility, one of the features that Robert Hare thinks should be assessed as part of psychopathy. There's a specific item on the PCLR called criminal versatility. It's supposed to indicate whether an individual has features of psychopathy or not. I tend to say no, criminal versatility is important, but it should be something that we use psychopathy to predict, rather than saying that criminal versatility is indeed part of psychopathy.
Has been the total destruction of my life and my girlfriend's life.
Former computer engineer Bill Carnes, one of Ramirez's many victims. One night, Carnes and his girlfriend were assaulted in their bed. The woman was raped and Bill Carnes shot 3 times in the head. Bill Carnes ended up in a group home with a bullet still lodged in his brain.
He stole my memory. He took my girlfriend. He took my career. And this was just an unprovoked attack.
So the victim mentioned that it was an unprovoked attack, and again, that's something that we might be more likely to see among individuals with strong features of psychopathy, that increased tendency to engage in instrumental aggression.
After dozens of such attacks, police identified their suspect, and on the morning of August 1st, 1985, Richard Ramirez's picture ran on front pages, and within hours, angry residents of this East LA neighborhood spotted, captured, and then severely beat Richard Ramirez as he tried to steal a car to evade police.
So at the 155 mark, or just before that, you heard about how he had stolen a police car. And again, that's something that you might see as more likely be present amongst individuals with features of psychopathy, because they tend to be risk-taking, reckless, and they're going to be maybe more likely to try to evade police or escape from police.
We're happy to announce that the individual we have in custody is Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
I can't begin to tell you how proud we, all of us, are of the people in this community who, to a man and a woman, were involved in trying to track this guy down and capture him.
That night, there was dancing in the streets of the East LA neighborhood where Ramirez was caught, but in court, the case dragged on for 4 long years, with the Texas drifter frequently disrupting the proceedings by displaying satanic signs and shouting obscenities at the judge.
And so that's another thing that you might be more likely to see amongst individuals with features of psychopathy is outbursts in court. And you can see this for a couple of reasons. Like, one will be that, they're intolerant of the opinion of others, and they're just in general kind of like impulsive, have low self-control, and the court process is long and boring. So for people with instant gratification, they're not going to have a very pleasant time. But what I think is also really important to think about is that individuals with features of psychopathy tend to be domineering and controlling. And in court, they give up a lot of that sense of control. They're told to sit, they're told where to sit, they are required to listen to the judge, they can't really talk back to the judge. Their lawyer is there to speak on their behalf, they don't really get to speak much at all. And so this loss of control is something that individuals with features of psychopathy might find very frustrating, and maybe they'll be more prone for outbursts like this.
Trial is a joke.
With the jury in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Richard Ramirez, guilty of murder.
But in the end, the jury sent Richard Ramirez to California's death row for 13 murders. I first met Richard Ramirez shortly after his L.A. conviction. Richard had been transferred to a jail in San Francisco, where he was charged with and ultimately would be found guilty of a 14th murder.
What do you want the world to know about you?
The world has been fed many lies about me. I have read very few truths.
Who are you?
So one of the things that I would recommend for people who do want to develop like their interview style, if they are going to be assessing whether it's, for features of psychopathy or anything else, like literally this applies to doing any interview with anyone ever. It's especially when you start, you don't want to begin with a very confrontational approach, which I think this interviewer kind of did. There's a way to build rapport to get them to, open up to you and say the things that you're interested in learning. For this interview, you don't learn too much about Ramirez, and part of it might be because the interviewer really failed to develop any sense of rapport with Ramirez, kind of a confrontational question. One of the things that you can learn to do is really work on open-ended questions. And another thing that you can work on is, instead of saying things like, why did you do that, which sounds more challenging, you can say something like, how come you did that, which is a little bit more open-ended and gives the individual sort of the sense that you are not necessarily doubting or criticizing the decision that they made. One of the things that I want you to also pay attention to is the number of sighs that Ramirez will make throughout the interview. And we all have kind of tics and things that we will do as a way of speaking, but I think these sighs are not involuntary. They are sighs because of feigning frustration. And I've experienced this interviewing kids with particularly high IQ that also showed strong features of psychopathy. And in general, individuals with features of psychopathy do not tend to have a high IQ, but for those that do, they really can look down on you as the interviewer or you as the clinician, whatever position you might be in. And so these sides, I think, is basically Richard Ramirez saying to the interviewer, like, this is so frustrating. How do I dumb down all of the brilliant things that I have to say to such a small mind, such as the reporters in this particular case?
Just a guy. Just a guy.
At the time, Ramirez was certainly a guy attracting a lot of attention. Since his arrival at the San Francisco jail, women from around the country, including one of the female jurors who had found him guilty in Los Angeles, had been flocking to the San Francisco facility, even fighting with each other over Richard's affections.
I have friends. That is all I care to say, really. They are open-minded people.
And it was here, in a cramped room in a San Francisco jail, that
One of the other things that we might see here is talking about friends and saying that they are open-minded people. This might just be more of a case of Ramirez not wanting anybody to really be judging him or wanting to have friends that are going to be kind of pushovers that he can take advantage of. So if they're open-minded, maybe they're less likely to criticize his behavior or less likely to hold him accountable for the negative things that he does, which is something that someone with features of psychopathy would prefer because that makes it easier for them to manipulate or take advantage of other people.
Interviewed the man known as the Night Stalker, a memorable face-off with me asking questions and Ramirez, for the most part, reading from a script.
Did you kill 13 people?
It would be improper for me to comment on my LA convictions and on my pending case here in San Francisco.
Why?
Because of my appeals.
Are you appealing these because you say you're innocent? You didn't kill 13 people?
That is correct.
You didn't kill 13 people?
Again, it would be improper for me to comment in any regard to that question.
You have now entered.
So just before that, what we saw was again a bad example of a question because there was no real opportunity for Ramirez to say anything other than yes or no there. Like, did you kill those people? Yes or no. What I would also recommend is that when you're assessing for features of psychopathy, whether they actually committed those crimes can actually be irrelevant to their rating on features of psychopathy. So we'll learn about the comprehensive assessment of psychopathic personality later in the lecture. And what we can sort of take away from this instrument is that you can assess for features of psychopathy without having to reference anybody's criminal behavior. You can also tell that Ramirez is kind of like regurgitating things that maybe he had pre-planned before he entered this interview. And this could again be an example of his interpersonal features of psychopathy, where he wants to control the interview, so he's kind of developed a script of exactly what he is going to say. Before we go forward, watch what Ramirez does when the interviewer reads off a list of names of serial killers. So look for it right now.
A very rare group of people in this country. You're in the ranks of Charlie Manson, Ted Bundy. You claim you didn't commit these murders, but you're right in there now as far as everybody else is concerned.
Serial killers do on a small scale what governments do on a large one.
So you can see he leans over and kind of smiles because he wants to have that notoriety. You recall that for individuals with features of psychopathy, they want to be unique. They believe that they are special and better than other people. And this kind of gives Ramirez some attention. Of course, it's negative attention, but he might not necessarily care about that. And then you can also see right away he sort of reverts back to his tendency to want to control the interview by interrupting the interviewer and talking about something completely unrelated. And I think this is, again, really important as an example of what individuals with strong features of psychopathy tend to be, and that's like verbose or grandiose. So they'll go on these long-winded tangents that might not necessarily have anything to do with the actual conversation, but again, it's part of that desire to control. They want to talk about what they want to talk about, and that's one of those controlling features of psychopathy.
They are a product of the times, and these are bloodthirsty times. Even psychopaths have emotions if you dig deep enough. But then again, maybe they don't.
Do you have emotions, Richard?
No comment.
Tell me what kind of emotions you got going through you right now.
I'll tell you what, I gave up on love and happiness a long time ago.
Why?
I don't care to explain that.
Somebody-
Let the quote stand for itself. People,
One of the things that's interesting, and this is again just speculation, it's something that if I was interviewing, I would want to follow up more with. But one of the things with individuals with features of psychopathy, they can like hear sound, but they don't feel the music. And that's sort of like an analogy for how like they know what emotions are, but they don't necessarily actually feel them. And so when the interviewer asked Ramirez to tell him about like why he gave up on love and happiness, he might have a difficult time actually talking about emotions because they're not things that he's really experienced in depth at any point in his life.
people in this day and age are brainwashed and programmed like a computer at being nothing more than puppets. This nation, this country is founded in violence. Violent delights tend to have violent ends. Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, people, and ages, it is a rule. Killing is killing, whether done for duty, profit, or fun. Men murdered themselves into this democracy.
Again, one of the things that we can see here is maybe a bit of a failure to accept responsibility or trying to deflect his responsibility for homicide by saying, well, men murdered themselves into this democracy, so it's not like what I am doing is any worse than what government has done in the past. The different quotes that he strings together aren't necessarily all related, and it's sort of again speaking to the grandiose and verbose nature of individuals with features of psychopathy. They can be kind of garrulous. They'll just talk and talk and talk, and sometimes it can be very difficult to follow their train of thought, and it can make you actually feel stupid because you're like, I don't understand where they're going with this, and really they don't either. It's just that they like that idea of constantly talking and again constantly being in control.
You're good at reading your script, Richard, but you're not much at answering my direct questions. A lot was made that you're a devil worshiper. Do you worship the devil? Have you ever studied Satanism?
There are different sects of Satanism.
Have you just yes or no? Have you studied Satanism?
Yes, I have.
Are you a worshiper of the devil?
No comment.
Come on, Richard.
I can tell you a little bit about Satanism.
Well, I'm interested in hearing what you got to say then.
It is undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. It is power without charity. A Satanist admits to being evil.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
Yes, I am evil.
When Ramirez tried to turn the question back on the reporter, that's actually something that's very common for individuals with features of psychopathy. And maybe initially, especially if they're more charming than Ramirez, you might think that they just are caring about your perspective on things. It's sort of a natural part of conversation. I ask you how you're doing, and then you're supposed to ask me how I'm doing. But for individuals with features of psychopathy, the reason why they can be turning these questions back on the interviewer is to try and again have that feeling of control. The interviewer can tend to be in a position of power because they get to dictate where the question and answer goes. Whereas if the interviewee can kind of turn things back on the reviewer, that gives the interviewee a little bit more power.
Not 100%, but I am evil. Evil has always existed. The perfect world most people seek shall never come to pass, and it's going to get worse. The great epochs of our life is when we gain the courage to rebaptize our evil qualities.
Okay, so we'll end it there. I know this is like a non-traditional way of going through things with you. So hopefully, though, you were able to follow along both with the audio and the video on your own computer, and we'll switch back to the regular part of the lecture now. Let's go back to the DSM, Access to Personality Disorders, and remind ourselves of what a personality disorder actually is and what this means for psychopathy. So remember, there has to be some form of functional impairment for it to be a mental disorder. Personality disorders impact how an individual interacts with themselves. So for psychopathy, we could think about that as the affective component. with others, and that could be the interpersonal component, and their environment could maybe be part of that like irresponsible, impulsive features of psychopathy. One of the things that's key is that as a personality disorder, psychopathy cannot be diagnosed prior to age 18. Features of psychopathy can change, especially during adolescence, and the definition of a personality disorder is supposed to be that these features are going to be stable over the life. So it's not just a rule of psychopathy, it's a rule of all personality disorders cannot be diagnosed prior to age 18, because age 18 is seen as that start of adulthood. I would argue that maybe since brain development really does not end until age 25, perhaps we should focus on age 25 as the cut point for when we can or cannot diagnose somebody with psychopathy. What we really should be doing is a case-by-case basis, where we should look at the cognitive functioning, the developmental status of the individual to identify whether or not we can or cannot diagnose psychopathy. However, case-by-case bases can lead to a lot of variation among clinicians or across jurisdictions in what the prevalence of psychopathy might be, and that's why they use this hard and fast criteria of age 18, though I do think that if we were to rely on a particular criteria, relying on age 25 would be better based on sort of what we're seeing in the neurocognitive literature. A lot of the research that I've been focusing on in the last couple of years has been following longitudinally kids with features of psychopathy or who have been assessed for psychopathy and examine whether these individuals' features of psychopathy change over time. I use what's called the Pathways to Desistance Study dataset. 1,300 kids who were interviewed in custody centers in Phoenix, Arizona and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania were followed longitudinally, basically between around 15, 16 years old up until 22, 23 years old. And what we see is that from year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3, there is a lot of variability in somebody's features of psychopathy. An individual can score high at one time period and then low at another, and then sort of back to middle, back to low. And so this is really why we have to be very careful about labels. That's why I always use, or try to always use, the term features of psychopathy when describing adolescence, as opposed to terms like psychopathy, which imply that this is a personality disorder that's going to be stable over time. I don't see that evidence. There are other people in forensic psychology that have referred to adolescents with high features of psychopathy as fledgling psychopaths. And I think this is really potentially damaging language. We talked about, like, we have to talk about Kevin. We're showing real strong signs of callous unemotional traits and how this can impact the parents. Imagine you're a clinician or a probation officer or anything like that, and you have a client who is 16 years old, and you tell their family that your son or daughter is a psychopath. How might that negatively impact the interaction between the family and your client? Maybe the family is going to treat that client more harshly or give up on them, abandon them, believe that there's nothing that they can possibly do to make this other person like truly care about them. And so that's why I think we have to be very careful with language. It's not just about the language itself, it's about the consequences of the language, and that we can be doing more harm by using these types of terms. While we can't diagnose a child or adolescent with psychopathy, we certainly can assess for it. In fact, what we really think is quite clear is that symptoms of psychopathy do not arise de novo in adulthood. What this means is that someone doesn't turn 23, 24 years old and then suddenly show really strong signs of psychopathy. We tend to see individuals, let's say if we have a 35-year-old man, he's in a federal custody center here in BC, and he shows strong signs of psychopathy. If he were to receive the PCLR, he would score 33 out of 40, which meets the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. That individual has likely shown features of psychopathy since they were a young child. So here's a way to think about it. Most adults with really strong features of psychopathy showed strong features of psychopathy in childhood and adolescence. However, not all children and adolescents with really strong features of psychopathy in these developmental stages will continue to show such features of psychopathy in adult developmental stages. Although we don't diagnose adolescents with psychopathy as a personality disorder, DSM-5 includes criteria for conduct disorder. Basically, we're looking at repetitive and persistent behavior violating the rights of others, or animals, being aggressive towards other people, destroying property, engaging in theft, and so on. Conduct disorder is one of the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And in addition to the diagnosis of conduct disorder, the DSM-5 includes what they call a limited prosocial emotions specifier. So just like antisocial personality disorder has that psychopathy specifier, conduct disorder, which can be diagnosed and can only be diagnosed in children and adolescents, also includes a specifier of limited prosocial emotions. And these limited prosocial emotions really reflect the core features of psychopathy, including a lack of remorse, callous and unemotional traits, shallow affect, and a lack of concern for performance. So they don't really care about how they do in school, or if they live up to other people's expectations or the promises that they said they would keep to other people. And so it's the interaction between conduct disorder and limited prosocial emotions that might be the key sort of building blocks to adult psychopathy. And again, in fact, as I mentioned, conduct disorder in adolescence is a necessary diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So limited prosocial emotions are capturing those key features of psychopathy, and these can be assessed in adolescence and used to diagnose conduct disorder with that LPE specifier. And I should mention that to diagnose someone with conduct disorder, at least 3 symptoms out of 15 total symptoms must be present within the last 12 months, and at least one of those symptoms has to be present within the last 6 months, because some forms of antisocial behavior, especially in early childhood, are really quite normal. And we'll see this when I talk about aggression in our violent offending lecture in a couple of weeks. To be diagnosed with conduct disorder, the symptoms must cause severe impairment in social and academic functioning. And again, it's a disorder that's diagnosed prior to adulthood. One thing that we definitely don't know enough about is what causes psychopathy, what leads to someone becoming a psychopath. And we'll see in like the media and pop culture, there'll be things like enuresis, which is bedwetting, and cruelty to animals, and fire setting. These are the key factors that are going to lead to psychopathy. I'm not so sure that this is necessarily the case. I think it's a tendency to focus on those factors because we tend to see them linked to involvement in serial killing, especially in pop culture. I would say that most individuals' features of psychopathy maybe don't meet those 3 factors, especially the bedwetting factor. So there are 3 kind of perspectives on what might cause psychopathy. There's the purely genetic perspective, the purely environmental perspective, or the gene times environment interaction. I imagine you can guess which one that I'll be more likely to endorse. But the environmental cause would say that things like physical and sexual abuse experiences shut people off from the people that they're supposed to be closest to. Physical and sexual abuse experiences that happen to children are often going to happen from a family member or somebody known to the family as opposed to a complete stranger. And this can lead to sort of a damaging of neural pathways where the individual is going to develop callous and unemotional traits. They're not going to want to interact with other people, and this can sort of build in features of psychopathy. The genetic perspective suggests that a person's personality is basically set in stone, and it's something that individuals are entirely born with. There's no such thing as a psychopathy gene or anything like that, but there would be a set of traits that develop in individuals before they're born that dictate whether or not they're going to have features of psychopathy. The third perspective of that interaction perspective would suggest that individuals are born with a propensity for certain features of psychopathy that will only manifest if they also experience a very negative environment. So if they have these specific genetic predispositions that are brought about by experiences of, say, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. Another big distinction that is made in the literature and is what people have referred to as primary psychopathy versus secondary psychopathy. For primary psychopathy, it's believed that the key traits relate to the interpersonal and affective dimensions of psychopathy, especially affective ones, where an individual will have like hostile interpretations of other people and engage in callous and harmful acts based on like things like their misunderstanding of the emotional content of words that other people are using. So primary psychopathy, people would argue, is genetically developed as well. Whereas secondary psychopathy, there might be more of an emphasis on environmental precursors. The child's environment influence secondary psychopathy, where the primary features of psychopathy, I shouldn't use the word primary, but you get what I mean. The main features of psychopathy for individuals with secondary psychopathy would be those impulsive, irresponsible traits. These individuals tend to have an overactive behavioral activation system, basically suggesting that they're constantly on that fight sort of mode. We should be cautious about using terms like primary and secondary psychopathy because these are categorical distinctions. They refer to specific subtypes. And remember, with mental disorders in general, and especially personality disorders, we think about these disorders as dimensional rather than specific categories. So psychopathy, just like other mental disorders, has been subject to the debate about, is it type or a trait? So a type means a taxon, a specific category. They are qualitatively different from all other people. A trait suggests that psychopathy exists as a continuum. It's a matter of degree. All individuals have some features of psychopathy, and it's just a matter of who has less versus more features of psychopathy, and at what point in time does these more features of psychopathy become so concerning that we would say that these are the individuals with high features of psychopathy. I tend to lean towards the idea that psychopathy is a trait-based disorder, that if we were to administer an instrument measuring psychopathy to this class, including myself, all of us would probably score something on psychopathy. We would probably all score very, very low, like 1, 2 out of 40 on the PCL, but we would have at least some score. And so that's why it's not as if these traits that are associated with psychopathy are only associated with psychopathy. Narcissism, grandiosity, impulsivity, deceitfulness, these aren't traits that only exist for people with psychopathy. Again, for these subtypes, how we would define primary psychopathy, we would tend to see a greater level of dominance, arrogance, a lack of empathy, sort of having a lack of affect or emotion towards others. So it's not to say that primary and secondary psychopathy cannot exist. It's just that you should avoid saying that an individual is definitively a primary psychopath or definitively a secondary psychopath. Maybe it's just the case that individuals might tend to score higher on measures that are traditionally associated with primary psychopathy versus dysfunctional behavior, elevated levels of stress and anxiety that are maybe more so a characteristic of secondary psychopathy. When we're discussing psychopathy, especially the development of symptoms of psychopathy, there are 3 key terms that I believe are important to define and understand. One is heterotypic continuity. This is the idea that symptoms of psychopathy will manifest differently at different points in the life course. This is why how we assess for features of psychopathy in childhood and in adolescence and in adulthood all differ. For example, we cannot look at things like relationship instability in adolescence compared to adulthood. So in adulthood, relationship instability can be used as an indicator of a feature of psychopathy. In adolescence, however, frequently changing relationships might be relatively normal. These are a time period where individuals are just beginning to get a sense of their identity, who they are as a person and who they're compatible with. So we might see a lot of changes in relationships for an adolescent. This doesn't mean that they're an individual with features of psychopathy. Similarly, in childhood, there are certain expectations that we have of individuals that just aren't reasonable. In adolescence, if a friend is having a hard time, we would expect that adolescent to be able to have like the cognitive or emotional empathy skills to go to that individual and help talk through the problem that they're experiencing. In childhood, we might not be able to expect that all kids will have that skill or empathy as a skill. and be able to talk with their friends in that way. We might be more suited to measuring empathy in children based on things like their ability to share toys with others, to get along with other people requires some form of empathy, because getting along with people often requires compromise. And part of compromise is understanding how other people might be feeling, and that requires empathy. So heterotypic continuity dictates that we need to be measuring symptoms of psychopathy in different ways depending on the age stage of the individual. Equifinality is another important term that really gets at sort of the causes of psychopathy, where we understand that there are different developmental pathways to the same outcome. So what that means is that not all individuals with psychopathy have to take the same route to get there. Some individuals might appear to be purely genetically based. They have no evidence of a dysfunctional family environment, abuse experiences, and so on. Whereas other individuals, maybe no history of psychopathy in the family of origin, they experienced a very negative environment, and maybe these environmental deficits contributed to psychopathy. So different routes to the same outcome is what we mean by equifinality. Multifinality is kind of the opposite of that, where we can take a single developmental disorder and identify different outcomes with that single developmental disorder. So for example, not all individuals with conduct disorder will also develop psychopathy, so they can go in these different directions. For clarity, I'll go through a real specific example of heterotypic continuity in terms of how it relates to the expression of empathy or impairments in empathy at different developmental stages. So in childhood, Paul Frick, who we've talked about before, remember he looked at callous unemotional traits in children, he developed an assessment tool called the Antisocial Process Screening Device, or APSD, not to be confused with Antisocial Personality Disorder, or ASPD. And this instrument was meant to be used by parents or by teachers to assess the child on a number of different features thought to represent psychopathy at this early developmental stage, so for children who are about ages 3 to 10, 11 years old. For this instrument, one of the things that you would look at is, when it comes to a lack of empathy, difficulty connecting and playing with peers. In adolescence, however, these are things that should be really quite common, where you'd expect this type of empathy to be so common amongst even individuals that do show strong features of psychopathy. So we're expecting in adolescence individuals' skills in empathetic reasoning to have developed a little bit. So then we would look at things like disregard for how their behavior impacts victims. So negative behavior, can the individual recognize how that behavior might impact another person? And this is used in instruments like the Psychopathy Checklist Youth version, the Youth Psychopathic Traits Inventory, to actually measure features of a lack of empathy in adolescence. Now in adulthood, we might expect or have higher expectations of an individual's ability to show empathy. So it's not enough just to be aware of how one's own behavior impacts another person, but the ability to understand how events or actions external to you can impact an intimate partner, as an example. So in this case, it's requiring the individual to recognize not just how their behavior impacts others, but how others are impacted by other events, and the ability to meet the emotional needs of that other person, that partner. And this is something that maybe adolescents can have, but we don't necessarily view their inability to understand the emotional needs of a partner as a sign of features of psychopathy. Psychopathy is so important to criminology. Maybe most importantly, psychopathy is associated with a greater risk of general recidivism and violent recidivism. It's also associated with a greater overall frequency of offending. In my own work for my PhD dissertation, I focused on assessing psychopathy among adolescents and following individuals up through adulthood. So psychopathy assessed in the age of 15, 16 years old, and looking through the 20s to see which individuals do or do not continue to offend. and individuals with the stronger symptoms of psychopathy were significantly more likely to continue to offend at a higher rate compared to individuals without those really strong features. If you are working within an institution, you're also particularly concerned about features of psychopathy because it can be related to institutional misconduct. So kids with higher levels of psychopathy may be more prone to assaults on staff or other kids in the custody center or engaging in vandalism, destruction of property, and so on. There's some really interesting controversy right now about the appropriateness of using measures of psychopathy in hearings in the United States that have to do with whether or not someone should receive the death penalty. And I think it's very important that scholars are having these conversations because they're suggesting that we need to be careful because maybe our assessment of psychopathy can be inaccurate. The key issue here for psychopathy researchers is they're not certain that in adults we have consistently strong predictors of whether somebody would be better suited to living in a custody center for the rest of their life compared to actually receiving the death penalty. So when it comes to like the general prevalence, individuals with strong features of psychopathy represent about 15 to 20% of the prison population, whereas, again, as we mentioned, antisocial personality disorders may be closer to 80%. So these 15 to 20% of individuals represent a really important challenge to institutions and may constitute more staff being aware or monitoring this type of individual. Some people have said that people with features of psychopathy cannot be treated, and I really think that this is not accurate. We talked about how maybe it's difficult to treat personality disorders and symptoms of personality, but you can treat the individual in other ways through things like cognitive behavioral therapy to help them recognize how their actions can have a negative impact on themselves, or how to encourage such individuals to seek more positive types of behavior that are going to reward them for the types of behaviors that they engage in. One of the problems is that individuals with strong features of psychopathy tend to be more likely to either drop out of treatment or be kicked out of treatment for their behavior. So there's sometimes the difficulty with treatment isn't so much the efficacy of the treatment, it's ensuring that individuals actually do engage in this treatment in the first place. When they do complete it, there is evidence that it's actually going to help reduce, maybe not necessarily their features of psychopathy, but at least reduce the likelihood of offending in the future. We talked about theories on why features of psychopathy develop in the first place, like primary versus secondary psychopathy, genetics versus environment, and so on. Another type of theory is the theoretical perspective on why is it that individuals with strong features of psychopathy are more likely to offend. And the textbook goes into a whole bunch of different theories that basically kind of are rooted in the same idea. So I'm not going to ask you specific questions about specific theories on the exam, but I do want you to know the general idea about why individuals with strong features of psychopathy not just offend, but are more likely to continue to offend. And I see that these theories are more about why individuals with psychopathy continue to offend. These theories suggest that because the low level of emotional depth of individuals with psychopathy implies that they don't really experience the threat of consequence of their behavior, and they can basically be very unresponsive to the court's punishment of them. So they don't see the consequences of the behavior, they don't to themselves, and they don't really see how their behavior is going to cause harm to others. Combined with the fact that they can also be very easily angered, can lead to their involvement in criminal behavior. I've written a paper with Ray Corrado, Steve Hart, and Matt Delisi where we went into sort of why features of psychopathy can really influence involvement in offending from their different types of features that are present. So when we talk about interpersonal deficits, this results in individuals with features of psychopathy basically seeing almost everybody as a target for potential victimization. Individuals with psychopathy are actively looking to manipulate and dominate other people. They're not going to feel bad about this because of their affective deficits. They don't feel empathy for others. They lack that sense of remorse. So that frees them up to engage in this manipulative behavior. So these sound more like instrumental types of violence or aggression or offending, but individuals with psychopathy will also engage in reactive violence or reactive forms of offending. And this comes from the fact that they also tend to be high in behavioral deficits. They're impulsive, they're irresponsible. A really big misconception in YouTube videos is that individuals with features of psychopathy are always cold, calculating, and planned. I'm not saying that all individuals with features of psychopathy are never cold and calculating. I have talked to very cold, calculating youth with very strong features of psychopathy. But for the most part, individuals with strong features of psychopathy, they tend to also be impulsive. They're very reactive. They like to live in the moment. They prefer to live day to day and not really think about the consequences. So it's a bit of a misconception that individuals with strong features of psychopathy are always cold and calculating. There are examples, but I'd say they're more so the exception than the rule. Here's a quick diagram that I think helps us understand why psychopathy relates to offending, why it's such an important risk factor, not for offending more generally, but specifically for chronic, serious, and violent offending. In fact, I don't think that psychopathy is very useful for explaining offending in general. I think psychopathy is more so useful for understanding chronic, serious, and violent offending. And these circles try to help explain why. So we have the predictor on the left and the outcome on the right. The very top, we see personality, and then we see behavior. So everybody has a personality and everybody engages in behavior. So these are very broad ideas. That's why they're the largest circle. They're true for everybody. But we can use personality to help inform what somebody might do. Specific types of personality features are associated with specific types of behavior. One of these personality features is externalizing problems. Individuals that might have chronic disorder or opposition defiant disorder. This is more common compared to psychopathy, but not all individuals have these externalizing problems, so it's less common than basically general features of personality. And externalizing problems can lead to antisocial behavior. We go further down, and a rare form of personality trait that's a good predictor of offending is low self-control. Low self-control is useful for understanding why some people offend and other people do not offend. The real big problem with low self-control is that if we look at all offenders, if we look at an incarcerated population, we might see that like 90% of individuals have low self-control. How do we use that construct of low self-control to distinguish between the individuals that are going to offend one time and the individuals that will be chronic, serious, and violent over the course of their adulthood or over the entire life? Low self-control is too broad. It's too common amongst individuals involved in crime to help us make distinctions amongst this group. It's kind of like if I have a target and I say like a dartboard and there's a bullseye there. I tell you $50, I'm going to hit the bullseye. And shake, agree, and then I grab a bowling ball. And then I just walk 10 feet away, chuck the bowling ball at the dartboard and say, look, I hit the bullseye. So it's true, but I also hit everything around the bullseye. So low self-control is like this bowling ball. It's too broad. It lacks the specificity to help us with the nuance of not just who is on the dartboard, but how do we begin to understand that bullseye? That bullseye in this case being chronic, serious, and violent offending. Chronic, serious, and violent offending is quite rare. So we need a construct that's also similarly rare. And psychopathy, I believe, is that construct that is most valuable to understanding this rare form of offending. Psychopathy is useful for looking within a population of individuals involved in crime and helping us identify which individuals are most likely to continue to offend at a high rate over the life course. So psychopathy has become very important to risk assessment within the criminal justice system because of its ability to help make distinctions between individuals involved in offending once or twice and individuals who are going to be really high rate offenders over the life course. Very importantly again though, just because somebody has strong features of psychopathy does not mean that they will definitely become a high rate offender. Number one, features of psychopathy can change. Number two, even if the features of psychopathy do not change, maybe other things do change, like their responsiveness to cognitive behavioral therapy, their preference to go and do things that are going to have them rewarded rather than punished. These can all help reduce the likelihood that such an individual will continue to offend over the life course. Also important to point out, not all individuals who are chronic, serious, and violent and they're offending over the life course definitely have strong features of psychopathy. Gang involvement, substance use problems, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, these are all things not necessarily related to psychopathy that can also be risk factors for chronic, serious, and violent offending. So I think that psychopathy might be the most important risk factor for chronic, serious, and violent offending, but not the only risk factor for chronic, serious, and violent offending.
When I die and I lay me to rest, gonna go to the place that's the best. When I lay me down to die, going up to the spirit in the sky.
Now that we have a good understanding of what psychopathy is and why it's important for criminal justice system practitioners in terms of our ability to predict offending, start now with how do we actually go about measuring things. And this is where things get heated. There's a lot of animosity within the psychopathy research literature about what the best way to measure features of psychopathy actually are. And really this all came from, like, the person who got things started was Cleckley. He outlined 16 symptoms that he felt were characteristic of psychopathic personality disorder. So this is what's quite interesting, is that Cleckley was relying on people that he saw in the community to figure out what the core features of psychopathy actually were. Robert Hare is probably the one who's responsible for moving from like Cleckley's kind of informal measurement to actually creating a tool designed to be used by others to measure features of psychopathy. Robert Hare's goal was to create a clinical and objective assessment of psychopathy, not just for his own personal use, but one that could be used throughout the world. And the way he developed the checklist, you might think that he would do countless hours of research, days and days of interviewing individuals to identify the core features of psychopathy. In actuality, I heard this story from Steve Hart, who was at the time a grad student of Robert Hare. Robert Hare invited Steve and other grad students over to his place for a night, have a couple of bottles of wine, and basically brainstorm what they thought were all the key traits, behavioral indicators of psychopathy, as well as counter-indicators, so things that they felt were not evidence of psychopathy. Ultimately, they arrived at 22 symptoms that they believed captured Cleckley's psychopathic personality disorder characteristics, or PPD characteristics. They eventually adapted the PCL, it's now called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR, to include only 20 of these items. So the two symptoms that they removed were suicide ideation and past diagnosis of psychopathy. Using prior diagnosis of psychopathy to measure current psychopathy is definitely very tautological. They got rid of suicidal ideation because it was also just too common amongst other individuals in custody settings who had legitimate suicidal ideation who were actually experiencing depression. They initially had included suicidal ideation as a measure of psychopathy because they felt that individuals with features of psychopathy would be prone to manipulating other people, and one of the ways they might try to engage in manipulation was through feigning suicide or feigning suicidal ideation. They realized again that this was just a bad idea because you could be basically labeling individuals that are actually going through depression as showing features of psychopathy. So ultimately they settled on 20 symptoms. In addition to measuring psychopathy for adults, Hare also wanted to have a tool available for youth. So he also developed the PCLYV. The PCLYV was modified from the PCLR to reflect traits that are assumed to represent features of psychopathy among youth. So it's the same scoring, the same number of items, the same features or concepts of psychopathy, just that now we're looking at more specific youth-based manifestations of psychopathy. And I used the PCLYV a lot. It was one of two of the more commonly used instruments that I dealt with when I was assessing for psychopathy amongst youth. For both the PCLR and the PCLYV, research differs on whether we should think about psychopathy or think about the PCL family as a 3 or 4 factor model. So what does a factor model mean? Remember when I mentioned at the beginning of class in the definition of psychopathy that there were 3 key features. There was those interpersonal features, affective features, and behavioral features. Think about those features as specific facets or factors. The interpersonal feature is one that everybody agrees with, affective, everybody agrees with, and behavioral, everybody agrees with. Where the controversy exists is whether there should be a 4th factor which represents criminal behavior. So Hare, he included in his PCL family a 4th factor involvement in criminal behavior. So we'll look at the actual items that are included in each of the factors from the PCL family. For the interpersonal factor, there are 4 key items that are assessed: impression management, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and manipulation for personal gain. So again, all things that sort of deal with interactions with people. And how these are assessed is very important. So like pathological lying, it's not just somebody that has lied once or twice. It's somebody who shows persistent pattern of lying, even if it's not necessarily anything for them to gain. And for next week's lecture, I'll talk about examples of where I've seen pathological lying. The affective factor also includes 4 items. It includes a lack of remorse, so it doesn't care about their behavior's impact on others. Shallow affect, which is like a lack of emotional depth. Callous, or a lack of empathy, where individuals don't feel for the negative experiences of others. And failure to accept responsibility. So the individual does not really take the blame for their behavior. Somebody else is to blame because they precipitated it. They looked at them the wrong way. They shouldn't be punished because other people don't get punished for this behavior, and so on. In the PCL family, when I use that term PCL family, I'm just using it to refer to both the YV and the R. The lifestyle factor is meant to represent that behavioral domain of functioning. So it deals with things like stimulation seeking, so people maybe engaging in risk-taking behaviors, drug use to get that sense of stimulation, a parasitic orientation, which is kind of like constantly relying on others. Like the individual is an adult, they don't get a job, they rely on parents, family members, an intimate partner, friends to basically support their lifestyle. It also includes a lack of goals, which is defined as either not having goals or having unrealistic goals. Impulsivity is again kind of like not thinking before doing, whereas irresponsibility is failing to do the things that are expected of you, like show up on time for work, for appointments, and so on. The antisocial factor is the one that's very controversial. All of these are referring basically to criminal behavior. And again, the concern is that should we really be relying on crime and behavior to assess a personality disorder? So this is where the PCL receives some criticism. So to summarize the criticisms of the PCL family, for one, it could be considered tautological because of an over-reliance on behavior to explain or measure psychopathy, yet psychopathy is being used to measure or predict, behavior. There's also disagreement about the important number of factors representing psychopathy. What I do not want anybody to take away from this lecture is that there are definitely like those 4 facets of psychopathy of interpersonal, affective, lifestyle, and criminal or antisocial behavior. These are the 4 facets that statistically fit the PCL instrument. Similar to the first concern, there's criticism that there are too few personality-derived measures in the PCL family. If we look at the PCL-YV, 10 of the 20 items directly relate to behavior as opposed to personality traits. So central to kind of all of these themes is the idea that criminal behavior maybe is not supposed to be a central component of psychopathy. So David Cook, Steve Hart, who if you'll recall was Robert Hare's graduate student, Caroline Logan got together to develop a new instrument called the Comprehensive Assessment of Psychopathic Personality. And it's an instrument that I used a lot when I was assessing for psychopathy amongst adolescents. And remember that I said that things got a bit heated in developing these measurement tools. Recall Robert Hare, he wanted to develop a clinical and objective, widely used instrument, and that's why he created the PCL. And it wasn't just for the good of the field. Remember, I also mentioned that the PCL is an expert rating. What does this mean? You can't just give the PCLR to a teacher and ask them to complete it for a student, or give it to the parent, ask them to complete it for the child. You can't just give it to the child or the adult and expect them to be able to rate them appropriately on each of the 20 items. It requires somebody who's been trained in not just understanding the features of psychopathy, but on how to do the interview, how to ask the right questions, use follow-up questions, develop rapport, how to actually score the PCL in the right way. All of this requires training, and you can charge people money to train them. Different criminal justice system divisions will hire clinicians to train their other clinicians on how to use a particular instrument. So Robert Hare actually has a business called Darkstone Enterprises, which sounds like it's something out of the Bourne Identity, and he uses this company to go around the world, and him or his staff will train people on how to use the PCL. And this is a way for him to earn a sizable income. David Cook and one of his colleagues, Jennifer Scheme, wrote a series of papers about why the CAP was needed and why we needed to move away from measuring psychopathy using prior criminal behavior. Hare was so frustrated at this, he actually sued David Cook. He actually contacted the editor of a journal, basically demanded that they withdraw a paper written by David Cook. And I don't think it was just an academic reason. It wasn't just, I want to sue this person because I have an academic disagreement. That never happens. I think the entire reason for this lawsuit, which was eventually dropped, was to really try and monopolize, protect his one area of research, which was psychopathy, and the money that he made from it. So I'm critical of the PCL. Lots of people are critical of the PCL. I still think it is one of the best tools to use to measure psychopathy. It gets a lot of negative attention because it includes criminal behavior, but guess what? You can actually just exclude the criminal behavior facet from your statistical analysis. So you can sum up only the interpersonal, affective, and lifestyle facets from the PCL and use those to predict defending. So that's what I've done in the past. But what I've also done is use the comprehensive assessment of psychopathic personality, which I feel is a much more detailed, more personality-focused measure of psychopathy. As its name suggests, the CAP is far more comprehensive than the PCL. Remember I told you I didn't want you to walk away from this class thinking there was definitely a 3-factor model or definitely a 4-factor model of psychopathy, because those are both debates that are specific to the PCL. The CAP actually suggests that there are 6 dimensions, so again, factors, facets, dimensions, try to think of them, at least for the purposes of this class, as synonyms. CAP specified a 6-dimensional model of psychopathy, whereas the PCL had 20 items, the CAP has 33 items. The PCL scored those 20 items from 0, a 1, or a 2, whereas the CAP scored its 33 symptoms between a 0 and a 6. So much greater variability in ratings for the CAP. The main purpose of the CAP was to bring the assessment of psychopathy back to personality and away from the PCLYV's emphasis on criminal behavior. So the CAP actually makes no reference to offending in its instrument. You can accurately assess for psychopathy using the CAP without having to ever ask anybody a specific question about crimes that they have committed. Another big difference between the CAP and the PCL is how it was developed. So remember, Hare sat down with students and in like a matter of a day basically settled on those 22 and then eventually 20 items. Instead of the PCL approach, the CAP developer said we need to go and ask clinicians about their experiences in assessing psychopathy. So they actually sent a survey out to people involved in the assessment of psychopathy and asked them to identify relevant symptoms. Which symptoms are most relevant? Which are the least relevant? And basically some of these survey results showed that the PCL-based measures of psychopathy were maybe under including key personality symptoms and over including maybe less relevant behavioral symptoms, again according to this particular survey. So the CAP team found these different symptoms, identified 33 of them, and again sent ratings out to practitioners, asking the practitioners to basically say, do you agree with these key symptoms? And basically all the symptoms were rated as being very prototypical of psychopathy, which means they're very important to the assessment of the disorder. So I'm putting up some screenshots here to give you a sense of what the CAP interview looks like. So there's 2 parts to the CAP. There is the interview of the individual to get a sense of their features of psychopathy, and then the actual rating where we take the information from the interview and from file-based information and put together an individual score. And so we have to do a lot of ratings. In addition to the 33 symptoms, each symptom has 3 adjectival descriptors that basically are different elements of the symptom. So you have to score the symptom and then these 3 indicators. And we also score the symptom in 2 ways. We look at its strength and its functional impairment. So how strong is the symptom? And the functional impairment aspect is to what extent does this symptom actually get in the way of the individual's ability to lead a quality life? Like, does it interfere with their ability to get along with others? What you see here is the actual full instrument. So there are 6 domains: attachment, behavior, cognitive, dominance, emotion, and self. And when we do the next week's lecture, I'll provide a lot of details about what each of these domains really refer to. So within each domain, there are between 4 and 7 different symptoms reflecting core features of psychopathy. You'll notice when looking at these different symptoms that none of them make direct reference to criminal behavior. The closest one is aggression, but you can be aggressive without being involved in offending. So overall, this tool, I believe, better captures the core interpersonal and affective features of psychopathy. And I'll speak in a minute about some research that I think provides empirical evidence of my suspicion. And this is, to be fair, my own research that I've published in Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology, but I think it's really interesting and other studies have begun to replicate this finding. What do you need to know for the exam? You're seeing a lot of the CAP stuff here. What my expectation for the final exam is that students will be able to name all 6 domains and then be able to pick one of those domains. So maybe it's the attachment domain that you're going to focus on. And you should be able to name and describe each symptom within that domain. You don't need to memorize all 33 symptoms and their definitions. You just need to know all domains, pick one domain, and know all the symptoms within that domain. One of the things that I think is really new and exciting in research on psychopathy is looking at psychopathology networks. If you are interested in this, you might also get interested in network science. Martin Bouchard teaches a class on social networks of street gangs and organized crime. This is where we look at an individual as a node and their ties to other people. In psychology, we can look at psychopathology networks, where we look at the ties between symptoms of a disorder to try and figure out which symptoms of a disorder represent the core features of the disorder. So for example, the CAP has 33 symptoms. Are all of them equally related to psychopathy, or are all of them just as important? And if we can identify more important symptoms than others, maybe then we can tell treatment providers, hey, if you're going to treat psychopathy, here are the symptoms that you should focus on. Not just because they're important, but because they might actually influence other symptoms. So if you can treat empathy, maybe you can then reduce lack of remorse and reduce lack of emotional depth as well. So that's kind of one of the goals of network analysis. So there's some key terms you need to know here. A node represents a symptom. So nodes are virtually always represented by little circles. So a node in this case would represent a CAP symptom like lack of remorse, unempathic, and so on. An edge is a line between nodes, or a line between symptoms. The size of this edge represents the strength, the magnitude of the correlation between 2 nodes. So we can look at all of the symptoms and figure out which of them are most strongly related to other symptoms. Or we can look at symptoms that act as bridges to help influence or bring together the different domains or facets of psychopathy. So if we look at this slide here, we can see that that green node represented by C, it's tied to a lot of different symptoms. So it might be one of the most important symptoms to psychopathy. Then what we also see is that B node, sort of towards the left, it is also the only node that's tied to the A symptom. When we think about how do interpersonal and affective features come together to represent the whole of psychopathy, well, if B is a particular interpersonal symptom and A is a particular affective symptom, maybe the reason why psychopathy comes together is because of the correlation between these two symptoms. So that's just a conceptual example. We'll just go over what centrality indices mean. This is our way of figuring out which symptoms are most important. So remember when I talked about bridge symptoms? These are the ones that might help explain why interpersonal and affective deficits come together. If we look at this graph, we can see the H node. This is high in betweenus centrality. High betweenus centrality indicates a bridge symptom. So H is responsible for bringing that cluster of symptoms on the right, characterized by I, J, and so on, together with the cluster of symptoms on the left, A, B, D, and so on. Degree centrality and eigenvector centrality are very similar. I won't get into like the differences. Basically, they're just focusing on which nodes are most strongly connected to other nodes. Remember, it doesn't have to just be the greatest number of nodes. It can be the sum of the strength of the association between nodes. So you can't see it here because all the lines are the same size, but what you'll see in the next graph is that different edges, or those different lines, can be of different sizes, and so it's the magnitude of the sum of associations that really matters for degree centrality and eigenvector centrality. What I did, along with my colleagues Martin Bouchard and Eric Beauregard, was look at networks of the psychopathy symptoms measured by the CAP. So in orange, you'll see the attachment symptoms. Blue, you'll see the behavioral symptoms. In green, the cognitive symptoms. Yellow, the dominant symptoms. Purple, the emotion symptoms. And red, darker orange are the self symptoms. So what you can see here is that there are things that tend to cluster together. The dominant symptoms you can see along the left edge there, they all kind of cluster together. The attachment and the emotion symptoms tend to kind of cluster together towards the bottom and the middle. Some of the self symptoms cluster together, the cognitive symptoms cluster together. Then you can also make out the fact that some of the edges, some of the lines are stronger than others. So we could use this information to figure out what are the core features of psychopathy. And along the left side there, you can see that like A1 means attached, A2 means uncommitted. And basically what we saw was that the attachment and the emotion symptoms were the most important features of psychopathy. We reiterated that the core features of psychopathy relate to these interpersonal and affective personality features. Behavioral symptoms were not really as important. Basically, the core comprised of interpersonal and affective symptoms. We thought that anxiety was not particularly important for the measurement of psychopathy. So this is going to help us begin to understand how we go about the measurement of psychopathy. I know that this has been a little bit technical today, but I think it's really important to go through this so that when next time I talk about like my actual experiences assessing for psychopathy and looking at psychopathy in different persons involved in crime, you'll be in a better place to understand where I'm coming from.